That was close. Unitarian ministers suffer from hymnus interruptus if we don't get to the 5th verse of that particular song. Back when our congregation's home was on Banning Street, and I was working retailer's hours, I spent most of my weekdays off at the church. At the time, I was editor of the Communicator, church archivist, and one of the church's chaplains alongside Barb Fuller. I was also the district treasurer and later district president, so the Banning Street Church was pretty much home base for everything that wasn't work or family related. Looking back, I cannot fathom where I found the time or why my wife didn't leave me. It was during these years that I often found myself giving visitors tours of the building and talking about its distinctive history. Most visitors focused on one or more of 3 aspects of the building, beginning with the fact that the walls sloped outward, ever so slightly, but noticeably, which was not, as some supposed, a sign of structural instability, since the roof hung like a tent atop steel beams that rested on deep pilings, while the walls floated beneath it without bearing too much weight. Some fell in love with the magnificent Hook and Hastings tracker organ, which was built in the 1880s and acquired by the Women's Society of the church about 100 years ago. I'll confess that I miss that pipe organ, notwithstanding its quirks, being more drawn to organs than pianos. But that's a matter of taste. Even though I do sometimes fantasize about what an organ might look like in the closet off the side of the sanctuary. The third focus of visitors' attention were our beautiful stained glass windows, some of which we brought with us when we moved. The second time they've been relocated since they were first installed in the congregation's earlier building on Sherbrooke Street. Given the people we attract, owing to our liberality and openness to differing views, many expressed their appreciation that the windows' themes were secular rather than sacred, simply artistic instead of religious. And that's where I would need to stop them and correct their understanding. For the designer of the windows and the congregation that commissioned them would have been shocked, I say, by that assertion. When they were created in 1904, the windows expressed core spiritual values that the congregation held dear. And I'm convinced that as symbols of our tradition, they have stood the test of time. Back in the 80s, I used to sit and ponder the meaning of the windows, sometimes for hours on end, often with a book in hand. And I have returned to doing so over the past year. Like Emerson, I do appreciate the silence of the sanctuary when I can sit here by myself and gaze through these windows I have known pretty much my whole life. Storytelling has driven faith and religious practice, keeping them alive for millennia, according to Martin Lindstrom, who isn't a church person, but rather an expert on branding. He adds that every hymn, icon, and stained glass window in a church links to a story. So what are the stories in ours? Our stained glass windows were designed by Fred Swanson, a charter member of the First Icelandic Unitarian Society in 1891, who served as the congregation's secretary for 25 years. A painter and decorator by trade, he was widely known as a landscape artist and set designer for live theater. In addition to our windows, he designed the building in which they were first installed on the southeast corner of Sherbrooke Street and Sargent Avenue. He also designed the murals at the Icelandic Festival and most of the backdrops for plays that occurred in this city at the time. That church on Sherbrooke Street still stands, although it's hidden behind a facade added in the 1960s, the new owners having torn off the elegant Athenian columns that once graced the front. Fred's older brother was a Catholic priest, Father Jon Sveinsson, who was widely known in Iceland, Germany, and Japan. Yes, you heard that correctly. Iceland, Germany, and Japan as the children's author Noni. Decades after the two left Iceland, one for Europe and the other for North America, one for Catholicism and the other for Unitarianism, they were reunited in Reykjavik in 1930, owing to the intercession of Nobel laureate Halldór Laxness, who knew them both. And Fred's son-in-law was the animator, Charlie Thorson, Cartoon Charlie, whose work includes Bugs Bunny, Little Hiawatha, Sniffles the mouse, and Elmer the safety elephant. It's also said that he was involved in creating Disney's Snow White and 6 of the 7 dwarfs, all of them except Dopey. He didn't approve of their names, by the way. The two worked together painting murals in private homes, and we can only wonder what the motifs of our windows might have been if they had been a team when they were created. I could imagine animated characters in the place where the saints might otherwise be, staring out at us with big, wide eyes and innocent expressions. In consultation with Reverend Rugvalder Pétursson, the congregation's new minister at the time, Fred Swanson created designs for the 3 main windows, along with several smaller ones. Neither one appears to have left a clear record of their inspiration, and the church's official records are silent about the windows, other than their cost. In her 1970 book, Manitoban Stained Glass, Alice Hamilton described 2 of the 3 motifs: a mauve harp surmounted by a white star and surrounded by a green wreath, and a mauve torch with flame. Although she ignored or wasn't aware of the 3rd motif, and she confidently asserted that the symbols represent praise, faith in Christ's incarnation, and the triumph of salvation, although she offers no reasons for this conclusion. And what we know about the preaching in this church at that time would suggest that this interpretation was pretty wide of the mark. It's not that the windows couldn't be interpreted in this manner, especially by mainstream Christians. It's that few of this city's Unitarians would have interpreted them in that way. This wasn't how Icelandic Unitarians in this city talked about their faith, let alone what they emphasized, not even 120 years ago. However, back in 1981, Reverend Emil Gudmundsson, Stefania Sigurdsson, and others familiar with the Icelandic Unitarian story offered their interpretations of the windows and what inspired them. This occurred during a picnic lunch at the Noisa Unitarian camp, and I scribbled down notes on napkins, which were the only source of paper that afternoon. Afterwards, I spoke with Reverend Philip Peterson and enjoyed further conversations with Stefania and her brother Laurus. And in time, I came to appreciate that our windows weren't just pretty. They were intended to convey meaning. And the meanings they convey are spiritual, but not conventional. Moreover, whatever may have inspired their creation, the meaning of a work of art is never limited by the imagination of its creator, but opens up to meanings that may have been unimagined in the first place, hidden in the glass or clay that the creator shaped. In other words, the meaning of our windows has grown with time. Throughout his ministry, Reverend Rögvalder Peterson maintained that it was the mission of Unitarianism to build a fairer temple on the ruins of the old. And this theme is embedded in the first of the windows, which depict the pillars of an Athenian temple, reminding us of our roots in the philosophical traditions of Greece and Rome, while the heart and vine hanging from the arch appear to evoke the love of God and the teachings of Jesus. There are only two of these windows, whereas there are more of the other two motifs. And these two windows, the arch windows, were positioned in the front of the old Sherbrooke Street church, just behind the columns that Fred Swanson had designed. They welcomed people into the building from the street. The torch window is perhaps the most emblematic symbol of Unitarianism in the early years of the 20th century, although at the time the cross was still commonplace in most of our churches. However, outside of New England, the torch had supplanted the cross as a symbol of our liberal faith on church signs and letterheads, publications, and other places where some visual emblem was desired. After all, other churches have their symbols that they wear on their lapel pins or put up at the street corner. We needed ours. It will surprise none of you, I'm sure, that this particular symbol is the torch of truth, reflecting the importance of reason in our tradition and the spiritual legacy of the Enlightenment, while reminding us that revelation is not sealed. Following the truth wherever it leads, and discerning the truth whatever its source, is central to the liberal way in religion. This leaves the harp window, which has the most interesting and complicated backstory of all, so I will dwell upon it longer for this window, which I also happen to feel is the most beautiful of the three. But like my feelings about organs, that's a matter of taste. It does hint at praise, with its harp being a dominant feature, and it may well be possible to see hints of salvation in its laurel wreath, although my mind tends to see the promise of peace. The harp itself appears to have been modeled on the harp that appears on the gravestone of the poet Sigurður Breiðfjörð in Reykjavik. And each string has a name, according to Nobel laureate Halldór Laxness. One day I may do a sermon series on the names of the strings: joy, sorrow, love, heroism, and death. But the primary inspiration for the window is found elsewhere. There is good reason to believe, from my conversations with the elders 4 decades ago, that the window drew directly from the poem Njóla by the 19th century mathematician and educator Björn Gunnlaugsson. The sage with a child's heart, as he was described, who was claimed by Icelandic Unitarians as one of their spiritual ancestors. The notion that Björn inspired the harp window is reinforced by the fact that a copy of Njóla, which means night, has been placed in the cornerstones of 2 of this congregation's earlier buildings, including the one where the windows were first installed. It held a place akin to the Psalms in the heart of many Icelanders. If and when the old church on Banning Street is ever demolished, we will want to send a recovery team to claim the contents of the cornerstone. The cornerstone of the old Sherbrooke Street building is in the safekeeping of the Manitoba Museum. And sadly, when we celebrated our centennial, they weren't sharing. According to August Bjarnason, one of the few Unitarians in the old country and a philosopher himself, Bjorn was not especially quick-witted, but he had a deep understanding of the things he studied. "I'm not in a hurry to understand," Bjorn said, "but I understand when I understand." He supported the church even though he did not agree with all its doctrines. And although his faith was warm and sincere, he could not agree with the church's exclusionary teachings. He was a universalist. He was widely respected, loved by his students, but not everyone could understand him. From the time he was young, he was viewed as being odd and eccentric, even crazy at times. For example, when he was an older man, many residents of Reykjavik believed he was a ghost buster. They didn't have the word then, but cinema has provided us with one. That is, that he possessed the ability to dispose of ghosts by the use of calculus, which, if it were true, may be the best reason for studying the subject that vexes so many of us. Who are you going to call? He surveyed the inhabited parts of Iceland, and he survived them, and produced the first comprehensive map of the country, at least the terrain between the mountains and the sea, which took him 15 years to complete, including 13 summers in the field with a single assistant. He surveyed the country from its mountain peaks, something that hadn't occurred to surveyors before, which produced a surprisingly accurate map of the landscape below, even identifying the lava flows and hot springs and pools that dotted the country. It was also a good vantage point at nighttime, though. At night, or when he was kept from his work by the weather, he worked on Njola. First published in 1842 and revised slightly 11 years later, Njola is a philosophical meditation on the creation of the universe and its purpose. Keep your eyes on the window as I say this. It is said that Bjorn could identify every constellation in the nighttime sky that was visible to the naked eye, and that he knew every star to be a sun, each of which was circled by planets like those of our own solar system. All of this inspired in him a sense of humility and reverence, a sense of peace. As August Bjarnason understood Bjorn's thought, the universe is not a single thing, the monarchy of a single sovereign of the sun, but a republic of many suns at different stages of development. He speculated that it was energy, not matter, that formed the basis of the universe. Like Spinoza, Bjorn saw God as essentially coexistent with the universe itself. Everything is in our hands, the heavens seem to tell him, and the universe governs itself. Eternal life is here now, and it is all bound together by energy. Bjorn spoke of 5 levels of existence: the elements, plant life, animal life, rational life, and spiritual life, arguing that existence is developmental in nature, that is, evolutionary. Remember that he was writing these things before Darwin and before Einstein. Humankind appears to be created not for hasty completeness, he said, but to the eternal flourishing of development. It is the work of philosophy to discern the purpose of life, and everything serves life, from the mineral to the spiritual. Life itself is ever-changing. So it is that the laurel leaf of our stained glass window reflects the triumph of the spiritual in human life, the oneness of the universe, and the fundamental harmony that underlies it, what we call today the interdependent web of all existence. Windows without religious content, devoid of spiritual character? I say not. Our windows are as profoundly religious as any of the windows that you will see in the greatest cathedrals of Europe. Our windows are overflowing with stories and filled with meaning. They offer us a visual shorthand of ideas, concepts, and values that are at the heart of our liberal religious tradition. The stories we tell in words, our windows tell in glass. Each of our stained glass windows tells a story, reflections of our history, our values, our purposes. And each one contains stories yet untold, stories that may be for you to compose, shining towards our possibilities and our hopes for the future. As Marge Piercy wrote, we must shine with hope. Stained glass windows that shape light into icons glow like lanterns borne before a procession. Who can bear hope back into the world but us? Our closing hymn is number 1057, Go Lift It Up.